Welcome to the Lost Signals discusses philosophy, narrative, and the mechanics of criticism. In this show, we analyze the greatest minds of narratology, both classic and current. Enjoy. Hello, and welcome to, I think this has been a while since we've done one.
It has been quite a bit.
Lost Signals discusses narratology and philosophy. Today we're talking a subject which I have kind of a negative remembrance.
He's got a storied history with this subject.
But, it depends on the person here. We're talking about nostalgia. Mm-hmm. I'm Jonathan Ian Manzer, here with Scott Thurler.
I used to like it when you were better.
Me too. Stephen Ramosi.
I remember remembering more.
And Christopher Morgan.
Back in my day.
And so we're taking a look at two articles today about nostalgia. One is more of an artistic look at the use of nostalgia in art and media. Steve, do you have the title for that?
I do. It's On Nostalgia and Its Use in Film by Mike Burge.
And the other one, which is not necessarily a contrasting work, but takes a look at it from a different perspective, an economic perspective. Scott?
Which is How Hollywood Manipulates You by Using Your Childhood Memories, which I love, and is by Ben Ho.
You can imagine what that one's about.
So, Steve-O, would you like to begin by a brief synopsis of what your article is about?
Sure. So this is kind of talking about nostalgia through the lens of it being a useful tool in a creator's toolbox, I guess. The first line in it, which I kind of like in terms of opening this up, is memory is a beautiful thing. I can remember times of such enriching happiness and times of immensely crushing loneliness, times when life was doing exactly what it was meant to do, whether I liked it or not. And, this article kind of talks about the different movies that have come out, and we're in a time. This came out in May 2018. We're firmly entrenched, especially then. Especially now and especially then, in a time of a lot of nostalgic, especially in terms of film. You got all the comic book movies that are coming out, which he talks about in fairly good length in this, and other properties from our childhood that are kind of hitting the big screen and being rebooted and remastered and kind of going in their own directions. And he talks about how nostalgia can be this kind of good look on our past remembrances of film and TV and stuff that we had, but he also talks about how it can get to the point where it's like saccharine and just too much. So he mentions in terms of that, there are things like the Marvel comic movies that he enjoys, and which we also mostly enjoy, I think.
Pretty positive on them, sure.
And then there are things like Transformers that just
garbage
are trash, or like the G.I. Joe movies, which were just not good, and
third one was good.
The second one is actually surprisingly complex.
I was gonna say the first one is kind of like a live action remaking of Team America.
Sounds about right.
I'll say my favorite G.I. Joe remake was Warren Ellis did a cartoon.
And it was awesome.
Which was really
I forgot
good.
about that. Good call. Anyway.
But
one last, because we're going into nostalgia here.
Sure.
You guys remember somethingawful.com?
Yeah, of course.
They did Cobra After Action reports on G.I. Joe episodes. Great.
Amazing.
So, nostalgia.
Well, there were always those memes of the G.I. Joe, they did I forget what it was, the more you know things at the end of every G.I. Joe.
Oh, the PSA stuff, yeah.
And they did a bunch of hilarious
parodies of that, yes.
Outtakes of that. So check it out. But this article talks about how there is a certain artistic merit to some nostalgia, and then there are some things that are obviously like cash grabs. I get in my own words. There's a line in here that talks about like Netflix algorithms and pop culture references. It's no surprise that the things. This is a weird sentence, but it's no surprise that the things that we like will be used to sell products. But ironically, these things that act as fuel for the now will eventually be the things that become a trend to head, much like clothing, books, and other forms of art have in the past generations, deal with nostalgic culture overkill. And it kind of goes into that a little bit. I think this article is more kind of on the side of like nostalgia is okay.
Yes.
As far as
it's not as
like,
bad as everyone thinks it is.
It's like anything else.
zeitgeist.
I think where it comes down is it's like anything else. There's good and bad in this, almost its own genre.
In the use of it, yeah.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this was a direct response to Ready Player One, or at least influenced by that, which was controversial. Not controversial, maybe too strong of a word here, but was
an impetus to have a nostalgia discussion.
Ready Player One was fueled heavily by nostalgia, and whether it worked for you or not, it falls on the line of how you view nostalgia.
Well, exactly. So, like, there is a part at the end about that, and I'm going to definitely get to that in a minute. But just to talk about that for a second, like, there is this really interesting take on nostalgia where like things like Ready Player One are becoming big, where it's like the point is the nostalgia, and I myself am of two minds about that as well. Like, I liked Ready Player One, the book. I didn't really like the movie. This guy has an interesting take on the film, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, because I think that it's something that I didn't really think about when I was watching it. But anyway, so like he's going through it, and like I think this is kind of one of the theses of what he's trying to say. Like, being aware of the films you consume and understanding what the purpose is affects how you yourself are changed by the film, which arguably is the goal of most art. And kind of looking at it in that way is the almost, as I mentioned, like kind of the thesis of this, right? Like it's like, watch a movie. If it affects the like nostalgic center of your brain, that's one thing, but you still have to evaluate it for what it is on its own merits, right?
Outside of that, of
course. And I think that's a fine mindset to have in terms of nostalgia. He talks about things like Happy Days and the Wonder Years, in yesteryear, like looking at the nostalgia in the 70s and 80s, looking back to like the 50s and 60s, and he talks about movies, American Graffiti, Grease, A Christmas Story, Back to the Future, Sandlot, Forrest Gump, Iron Giant, all kind of doing the same type of thing, which I completely agree with. Like, right, these are things that came out between the 70s and 90s
or so,
that look back to a nostalgic time of, like, just post-war, usually post World War II, and the boom that America had going on then, which is an understandable thing to look back to with happiness. Like, it was going better than when World War II
those were the days.
On, that's for sure. At least for a lot of, or a good amount of American society. So there is that look back at it. I think that there is also, I'm going to do my own small thesis before I get into the Ready Player One stuff, but like, I think that there's also something to be said for being a little bit pessimistic or like wary of nostalgia, because I think a lot of times, and don't get me wrong, I'm a very nostalgic person, but like a lot of times it does try to undermine your sense of like understanding what the actual on-screen
message of given film
on page plot is, and what the actual messaging of the work is. But as long as you're wary of that and understand what it is, I think that there are nostalgic properties that work really well and
Can be
like,
well utilized.
Are good
Yeah.
pieces of art in their own right. So one of his actually, I'm fairly certain the largest paragraph in this.
One of the main thrusts.
He talks
is-
about Ready Player One, which is a work of pure nostalgia. It came out of a book, which I don't think he even mentions, but like he's talking about the movie. It came out of a book that was basically solely like Easter egg city.
Yeah, I was like, if I may say, Easter egg, the novel / film.
Hey, remember this?
Yeah, exactly. You must remember this. And like he talks about how the movie has this idea of hold on, I'm just going to read it. So, like, while the virtual reality retelling of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory's movie escapism in its most apparent form, the film also serves as a love letter to fandom and a cheery exploration of what it represents and how it affects different people. Which is interesting, but he also talks about there are clear examples of Spielberg. Hold on, I'm sorry. Ready Player One read to me, he says, more like a commentary on its own tropes and references than another installment in the pat yourself on the back, you nerd category.
He's saying it's sort of more meta-aware of itself than it seems on the
he's saying that
surface.
Spielberg was very aware of what he was doing when he made this and saying, like, let's look at what this is, which I didn't really get from the film. I thought it was more of a pat yourself
Straight
on the
up
back, you nerd
pandering kind of thing, yeah,
type
sure.
of movie. But looking at it in that sense, I think is really interesting. And going to the idea of like, oh, this is the type of thing that isn't necessarily just talking about what's at surface level, but is actually trying to get you to think about, by blasting you in the face with nostalgia, trying to get you to think about what nostalgia is and how it affects the way that you
And how prevalent it might be in
view media.
Yeah, exactly.
Might be more important than what it seems to be at face value. He does go on to say that, like, let's not forget Spielberg birthed the very first blockbuster in today's standards with Jaws. But it does. He says also that it does communicate the flaws and follies of relying on
Purely that.
yeah, on nostalgia too heavily. So I think that's pretty much a wrap up of what is going on in this paper or in this article. I thought it was interesting. I myself do have slight issues with both of these articles that we're going to discuss. I think I went a little bit into them, and I will certainly more, but I want to let somebody else talk because I feel like I've been talking for a very long time. So
Yeah, perhaps my life has changed slightly, and I'm a little less cynical than I used to be. But at time for a very long point in my life,
You were
I was
adamantly
very
against
cynical
nostalgia.
about
Sure.
everything, and perhaps because nothing ever good happened in my life, I have nothing to be nostalgic about. But
That's depressing thought, man.
but the idea is that I feel that there's a parallel that can be drawn between aspirational future films to what nostalgia does, because it's aspirational about the past, and both can become saccharine, both can be used for cynical purposes.
Yeah, they can
but
easily
they
fall
can
into
also
any of those
be
traps.
genuine.
mm,
And I think that perhaps a genuine celebration of the past, there's nothing wrong with that. Even though perhaps maybe a year ago or so I might have said there was something wrong with that because we shouldn't dwell upon the past. But there's no problem with looking back at a better, even if it is a false narrative of a better time in the past, if it's done for useful intent, then perhaps I can get behind that,
Or like-
just like I can for future.
Let's say
aspirational.
legit artistic reasons and not
Yes.
just solely for the sake of it itself,
Mhm.
in a
Or
sense,
cash grab.
which I think is like one of
Yeah.
the main thrusts
which I think is
of that
kind
one.
of the point.
Yeah.
All right, I was gonna. I have an idea to kind of foreshadow the article, but if we look at the hack J.J. Abrams, you look at something like Super 8, and it was completely a nod to Steven Spielberg. Steven Spielberg co-produced it. It's a banal movie, and but like if you look at the two biggest nostalgic franchises. Star Trek, which we all know is near and dear to my heart, and Star Wars. Now, Abrams did the first Star Trek, and except for a few things that were original about it, I feel like with the Kobayashi Maru, he understood...
Like different actors?
No. But he understood, like, that the Kobayashi Maru test was important, but he didn't understand what it was. But there's a lot of, remember this? Into Darkness thematically, I felt was a stronger movie. But again, I could feel his touches where it was like, remember this. And then you get to Star Trek Beyond, which was made by 3 Trekkies who grew up with it. And while it may not be a wholly original movie, it was
it's fucking Heart of Darkness, but Star Trek.
No, but getting back to these guys integrated the nostalgia and telling a story, and it worked really, really well because they were more involved in the story, even if it wasn't wholly original, and they integrated the nostalgia elements into it, but it did not detract from it. It wasn't like throwing up like, here we go.
Sure.
So you're saying that it's good to build upon the shoulders of giants. It's bad to skin that giant.
To simply wear it as yourself.
Yes.
This is something new and original.
Because the skin flops around. You can't fit in it right.
But then
it doesn't work as well.
But the problem that a lot of people, Trekkies said, is that he was very action oriented. Now, he always said that he grew up he was more of a Star Wars guy than a Star Trek guy.
J.J. Abrams?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Abrams. Then you get Star Wars, you get the first one, The Force Awakens. And it's basically a retelling of Star Wars, which is pretty much it had to be. And while I had my issues with it, what I liked best about The Last Jedi was that Rian Johnson really tried some new things. And like the stuff that a lot of people hated because it wasn't Star Trek is the stuff, or Star Wars rather, was the stuff that I loved. And the other parts of it were faults in that I don't think he went far enough with it. I think that so when you got to the most recent film where Abrams had it, you had a lot of ideas going on, but I don't really think he knew how to compose them. So my whole thing is, if you take it in a new direction, which again, I said before precast that I'd rather see a bad movie that I can appreciate for trying something new. Mm. So this would be the flip side of like Star Trek Beyond, which was he was trying different ideas that were antithetic, but trying to incorporate them that were much more interesting. Then it was a more interesting film than the Force Awakens, which was basically Abrams knew what a Star Wars movie was. And then the last movie was a mess because you had a lot of ideas that I don't think he quite understood because he knew what Star Wars was, but he didn't understand what Star Wars wasn't.
Yes.
And so, but that was my whole take on it was there's a point where you can integrate nostalgia and make a good movie, and you can detract from nostalgia and make a movie that to me was a complete hit and miss, but
was very up and down, if you will.
Yeah, but when you try to pander to nostalgia, I think is where you fail the most.
Do you have any thoughts?
I mean, so
or would
like,
you like to go into...
no, I mean, so I'll comment. I think I'll say I liked Steve-O's article that he sort of hosted, if you will, a little bit less than the one I'm about to talk about, but yeah, so like it's unavoidable, Chris. Like, obviously, you're going to bring up both of those franchises, but you can't help it because they're like the pillars of nostalgia in pop culture, or at least two of the biggest ones ever.
Yeah.
And I do think you can find a middle ground somewhere, like when done well, to pull elements from people's memories of quote unquote the better past, and while pushing art forward. So I think there is something we found now. It's difficult to find the right formula, or it's not often done, I'll say. Like, I agree with you. Like, I'm probably second to you in the sense that, like, I have a distaste for, like, when it's so obviously pandering, which we'll also probably get into in a second, but when it's so glaringly obviously there, then that removes me. Movie? Yeah, like, that removes me from it. That just cynically makes me, like, be like, go fuck yourself. You're not even trying. Like, you're just relying upon the fact that people already have an ingrained like for these things, like a predilection for it. So therefore, you don't have to advance the art. you can just fall back upon that and hope and like basically count on it carrying you through and carrying the audience through, like carrying the consumers through of whatever it may be. So while I do think I've also softened a little bit on it, like your article does point out that I think, Ian, you mentioned this precast, and maybe you can expand upon it, that the intent of a work with its use of nostalgia might matter. And as you pointed out, one of the lines is like, be aware of what you're consuming and know like sort of like the sort of the attributes around it, I guess, right? So you know what you're getting into, it's like going to be referencing in some way, or at least twinging on your nostalgic sensibilities to some degree, but be aware of that. And if it hits home, then that's fine if it works. But also, if it's just cynically there, then that's going to produce the opposite effect, I'll say.
And I think in a lot of ways it goes back to our discussion on Easter eggs. In that,
Sure.
in that,
Which we checked that one out.
yeah, callbacks and so forth, if they don't interrupt the narrative, like in other words, you're not highlighting
Right.
and saying,
If they're not there just for the sake of it,
Yeah.
if
Remember me.
if they add something to the original work, and thanks for that one.
or it's just the flavor of it.
Yeah, exactly. So, like, I guess I'll say, to cap off this section, is that I do agree that it can be well used, well executed in certain cases when the writers, etc., like the producers of a certain work, like we'll stick to films, I suppose, because most of the articles do the same. That it can be integrated in a natural, organic way that, again, isn't just lazy, isn't just like jerking off, like, okay, here it is, there you go, right? It can also be used to advance while acknowledging and while paying reverence and homage to what has come before.
If I may bring up one more thing, and I'm going to reference once again our Easter eggs thing. I loved Mass Effect because I thought it told a really compelling story, and as a science fiction fan, I got where the influences were. But they're doing the DLCs, and we agreed this is an Easter egg. When you get into in the casino part, you could play Rock'em Sock'em Robots, which was a nostalgia thing for me. And I played hours, literally playing hours of a game within a game, because to me, that was nostalgia that didn't interrupt the greater narrative.
Yeah, it made sense in context, right? So it wasn't just a lazy like inclusion.
Right.
like
And you
Rock'em
could see,
Sock'em
and you can see the influences, but
Sure.
it did not detract from the greater narrative.
Exactly. And that's probably that sentence there, I think, when that happens, it is going to be effective and not just like cynically when you encounter it, you're like, okay, they're just doing it for the sake of it. Now it actually makes sense. Now it has a purpose to it.
Rock'em Sock'em Robots was the best thing that. When did that come out? 80s?
I don't know.
No, it
Ever
came out in the 70s. I had it in 1975.
Chris was a kid. We weren't even
But,
alive.
I feel like that gets referenced so often in things like that. It's insane.
They made an entire movie based around it. not too long ago.
they did. And like so
Because of
many
nostalgia.
games have like
Sure.
Rock'em Sock'em Robots. Like
Looks, it's a very easy
Sims.
touchstone to go back to. But when integrated well, it won't feel just, again, lazy and cheap.
Also, it's one of the most memorable names.
Sure. I mean, it's catchy as shit. Its marketing was genius, obviously.
They really fucking nailed it on that one. Anyway, I'm sorry.
But
go
you
on.
asked me to bring up a topic, so I'm going to delve into that. Although perhaps it's better to be saved afterwards.
Okay, I just wanted to mention it and segue, introduce it.
I forget the actual names of the theory, but the idea of linguistics is, if I say a statement, what's more important? My intent in saying a statement or the audience's interpretation of what I said? And they're competing forces. So, oftentimes, if I said something that I would feel was mischaracterized as offensive, is it more important that I wasn't intending it to be offensive, or that you felt it was intensive? It's actually a huge thing in a lot of our discourse today.
Sure. Absolutely.
Or that is competing ideas, and the idea to that is nostalgia. Is it more important that the intent is to add a reference here or something like that, or if it's overboard, is it more important for the interpretation of the audience over whether nostalgia was used well or not, or the purpose of the intent of the creator to use nostalgia?
And I would say, to answer that just real quickly, it's a middle ground. Like, of course, it's going to be subjective. Like, you can't get around that. But when executed, like when laser guided, like well into any story, any medium, I think it will be effective to, like, it'll cover both ends to an acceptable degree for both the audience and the intent of the artists.
And if you want to go to humor, I'm not a fan of Mike Myers or, God damn it, I'm blocking the name, Seth MacFarlane, because a lot of times they use nostalgia as the joke and the punchline. It is definitely a wink at the audience, which Mike Myers does literally wink at the audience.
Sure.
Whereas opposed to like the better episodes of like, say, Archer or South Park, where the nostalgia is understanding and they just do a riff
It's in
on
service to the originality.
But I don't like it when they call out nostalgia.
Sure.
It irritates me.
But you're not everybody, and like
I said, it's going to be
some people
subjective.
for that,
But to answer the thing that you brought up is that's how I would sort of address it the best I could.
All right, now let's get on to your article there, because
Okay.
there's some interesting points in there.
So speaking of that, so I think I enjoyed this one more. So like I said, it's titled cynically so it's not clickbaity per se, but it's how Hollywood manipulates you by using your memories.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I believe Ben Ho.
clickbaited.
May I just say, I'm pretty sure that the person who wrote that headline, the person who wrote the article, are completely separate people.
Possibly. But I believe he's an economist himself. So, right. So it's through that bent. It's more like, I don't want to say cynical, but it's more like the behind the scenes look, right? And I find advertising and like manipulations of humans' psychology very fascinating. And this one specifically addresses why nostalgia is effective as a element to include in specifically films, but other things too, right? So it's sort of like a three-prong assault, so I'll read a line from it. By nostalgia, by tapping into our emotions, encourages us to buy a piece of a memory, and a moment in time when things seemed simpler and we thought we were happier, right? I really much like that. Like, that's sort of his opening salvo. And it goes on to talk about how various franchises, like, of course, Star Wars mentions that, like Jurassic Park stuff, things like that, is that there's sort of a tug of war between things that can nostalgia that can depreciate and appreciate. Again, it's all through an economics look at it. Mm-hmm. It's like, imagine stocks. Now, you buy stock and in theory, it will mature and therefore increase in value. Certain properties have that, like the ones I just mentioned. Certain ones will, in fact, devalue themselves. As one of you mentioned the G.I. Joe thing, or Transformers or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But the thing is,
I think the one that they mentioned is Avatar, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
So I mentioned that one too.
There's a huge spike.
The thing is, you can't, there's no way to predict that per se, but once one has reached maturity, then it's rock solid. It's an easy bet, which also mentions, it's not that artists are out of ideas or new and fresh ideas. It's that it's easier, cynically, to make money by marketing nostalgia to audiences because it's literally ingrained into your psychology. It's built in there, and therefore they have an edge upon you already.
Well, I don't know if you're getting to this point or not, but I want to bring it up because I thought this was really neat. I'm going to use the example of Star Wars here.
Okay.
So we have the original Star Wars, which people have a nostalgia for. They released the prequels, which introduces a new generation to Star Wars.
Sure.
So then over time, you have multiple generations having nostalgia for the same
property, but in different ways.
A different time period of that property.
Well, yeah, we experienced that when we went to the podcast movement for the first time, and we met a guy who was introduced.
Our buddy Cody.
Yeah,
check him out.
Who was
Rogue Squadron podcast.
Mm-hmm, who was introduced to Star Wars for the first time through the prequels, and he loved them. And we were all old
crotchety men
motherfuckers,
yeah.
And we were like, "Yeah, it sucked." And he was like, "Well, let me tell you about how they were great if you were fucking 9 years old when you saw them." Mm-hmm. And that makes sense. The original three aren't the best movies in the world, but they are amazing if you're a child, Mm-hmm. And I get that. Anyway, so I'm sorry.
But yeah, so that's part one, and part two I think is possibly more interesting to me. Again, it's that by nature, by being human, a lot of your formative things are from your early age. So let's say teenage to 20s, I think is what he mentions. Yeah. Right. So anything you encounter, especially artistic mediums, automatically ingrain themselves more. It forms a connection within you that you can never escape. And that's what nostalgia then preys upon later. I guess not preys upon, but induces.
It can. And I think that's one of the important things.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I tried to walk it back a bit, but because of that, so it's almost cyclical, right? Like you mentioned, Steve, that article too. In, let's say, another generation, another 20 years, there will be an up-and-coming people who, at that point, will be, let's say, 15 to 20, who are forming likes and dislikes and, encountering art that means something to them that then later can be used to sell back to them.
Yeah, when you reboot Iron Man.
Yeah, exactly. Like, but that's a good point because they bring up the Marvel stuff too.
Yeah.
Is that think of it this way? Whole MCU is sorry, Chris.
No. Go on.
The whole MCU, like to us, we grew up like the comics of the '90s, right? Anyone who was like, let's say 12 when Iron Man, the first one came out, that was their first experience with it. So in about 20 years, they'll have nostalgia for it as well. So like it crosses over, and that equals dollar signs by any business who's producing it.
I think that X-Men cartoon, Spider-Man cartoon is really our formative.
I agree with that. I mean,
more so than the comics.
It was.
I mean, I
for
read
us,
a lot.
Batman the animated series.
I read a shitload of comics too. I'm not saying like it just all sort of lumps it, like it builds up to a thing, and then when that came out, when the movie started coming out, we were like probably early mid-20s or so. So that creates like another layer beyond that, on top of that, and then there's another layer to be had by the following generation, who that will be their formative experiences, and then again, cynically, on a sliding scale, can be capitalized upon later on when they do whatever they're going to do after that. Right. So I thought it was very interesting because it's like the perfect marketing move. Because literally, you can't help it as a human, in a sense, right? So they're selling you your own memories for a time that may or may not have been better, but you think of it as such. So it's easy to market it that way, and therefore it's a safe bet. That's why they keep making. That's why they keep doing like Ghostbusters. I didn't even mention that, but I'm going to throw that one out there, like shit like that, because it's almost like they don't have to sell it to you. You're already invested in buying it.
Yeah, there's a line in my article that says, "Claiming you are never nostalgic is an exercise of stupidity. Trust me,
of course.
When your ex's song from years ago comes on the radio, you feel it, and there's no controlling or arguing that. Like it's the same thing with movies and stuff that you
100%. Exactly.
Like, whether or not you want to be nostalgic, you have to be to some degree.
Your psychosomatic system, if you will, responds to it.
And getting back to the reboots and so forth, about Iron Man, it's just like, and the studio execs at Warner Brothers and Marvel said, thank God for the multiverse, because we can always integrate it and bring people back.
Like, it's the most genius move ever in order to, like, if your goal is to capitalize upon this stuff and keep making money.
As long as you're making good movies, though.
That's what's fascinating, though. The unpredictability of it is such a neat, because we have demonstrative evidence of that in our world, where Marvel worked. But that's
Transformers.
Star Wars didn't work in a lot of senses.
It worked less well.
They made
a
fuckload of money,
and Transformers didn't work either. But they made a shit ton of money.
Yeah, but the idea is that it didn't have the.
They're not as well respected.
The resonance
that
exactly. The Marvel was. So you can think you have a formula for it to work, but there is no real formula. It's dependent upon whether it becomes part of the zeitgeist or not.
Exactly. It's social conditions, like that change moment to moment, or at least like generation to generation in a broad, rough way.
And if you look at theme parks, and here's a horrifying nightmare of Disney. My uncle used to say, going in the Main Street Disneyland or Disney World, when you walk in, it's not the roaring 90s, 1890s, or whatever, isn't exactly how it was, but how people wanted to think it was, how people remembered it, idealized that it was. But if you look at it now Disney owns Star Wars and Marvel. Part of their theme parks is like the Star Trek experience or whatever, because you want to recapture that for the changing audiences. And then these other theme parks are trying to grab up like Harry Potter World or what have you. And it's just like they're banking on their own
nostalgia, though.
Yeah, but banking on their own Main Street. Metaphorically speaking, but now that Disney owns all these properties, they can essentially create main streets within their own theme parks, whereas like Universal Studios or whatever has to grab with what's already there and make deals with other people. So I think it's really interesting that, like, even in theme parks, this is nothing new, but now they're branching out the way they're doing it with movies.
Epcot Center was one of the first like big theme park attractions, and that was all nostalgia.
Sure. Well,
or nostalgia in terms
nostalgia
of like,
bent, if you will.
It was like the future nostalgia, right? It was like the idea that the future will
world of tomorrow,
like the zero stuff. Yeah. But I want to make the one final point. I thought, again, it's somewhat cynical, but not too much. But the article, Ben Ho writes, anyone who complains that, quote, nothing is new anymore, we can only blame ourselves, because that's what people seem to want. And as we live in a capitalist society, that's what the market's going to deliver to you. So perhaps, like, if we all collectively demand, indeed, fresh ideas instead of, I like X, Y, or Z property from back in the day, I want to see him do it again. And studios like, we got you covered. Don't worry about it.
But here's the thing, and I'm to counter that, is that we can't escape that because humans are pattern recognition. So
that's what
what's our
exactly.
favorite studio right now?
A24.
A24. And that's the thing is, right now I'm set in a pattern of I want to see A24 movies because it's a trusted brand.
Of course.
And that's already building nostalgia for demand for something new because they produce new things. So it's weird that we can't escape it.
Edge, I get it, but I'm saying, like, I just want to mention that he points that out because I thought it was also fascinating. Again, giving my interest in looking behind the scenes at our psychological makeup, if you will, and how in our again capitalistic market scenario, how that is exploited, and the market gives the people what they want, more or less, and apparently for the most part, that's what the audiences are going to respond to.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting thing that you say. Like you're counting on nostalgia for what you're going to look at in the future. Like I guess that's kind of what I meant when I was talking about like the future nostalgia of Epcot, right? It's like the idea that like the future will be more like the present or the past, right? Like so, I want to continue to see that. Just
as such in that light.
Just like advanced, like, and that is kind of I don't know. I guess I'm kind of off topic at the moment, but like, that's kind of where my mind went to is like, here is what is happening now. Like, that is what we're going to want in the future, right? Like, that's what we're going to,
in theory,
that's what
kind
we're going
of,
to like harken back to and say, this is the good old days in the future, right? Like, I want that, but like futuristic, right? Like I want the next thing in A24. I want the next thing in like,
it's the hot hand fallacy,
right?
They've produced good work here, good work here, good work here. I'm going to bet that the next one because it's all about risk aversion. When it comes
and that's
to
exactly
business.
that's what I'm tying into. Yeah.
So nostalgia is one form of risk aversion, but also
100%.
the idea that this one's hot right now. It's going to continue to be in the future.
Yeah, I guess I'm saying like it's almost like inescapable because it's literally built into our biological makeup, for lack of a better description. So therefore, it's almost always going to be effective to some degree. So if you're trying to make money off of it, it's going to work better than most other things.
And kind of tying up a lot of things with A24, you have Ari Aster, and Hereditary is marketed as current day Exorcist, which it wasn't. It was more akin to Rosemary's Baby.
But if I may,
hold on a second. But Exorcist is the more recognizable thing.
Exactly. That's
but you look at Midsummer, which obviously looks like it's a retelling, so to speak, of The Wicker Man. In a lot of ways, it contains elements, but he did something new with it. So there's an example of somebody who has taken the marketing of the first film, towards something that was recognizable, even though it was more than that. I mean, it was a grief film, it was a horror film. And the second film, he took something recognizable where they didn't have to say, this is the modern day Wicker Man, but they kind of let it more speak for itself.
But that kind of almost proved my point is like the whole, like, it's the new Exorcist, and everyone fondly remembers The Exorcist as a great horror film, right?
And no, not as many people may know Rosemary's Baby, but again, with Midsummer, they didn't have to.
But if you are introducing yourself, because we're pattern recognition species, attaching yourself to a beloved property is a way to move forward. Where now I think A24 can stand on its own and just say, this is just an A24 film because it's built the brand.
That becomes the thing. Which, speaking of plug, we're going to do an A24 highlight for sure. But, I mean, it does tie in because of the way, like, at least the films you mentioned, like, the way that at least they were marketed might not have been representative of the films themselves, but it's such an effective tactic anyways, that's sort of why it created that buzz around it.
I want to do we'll talk about this later.
Okay.
But yeah, there is this, like, really interesting thing. And in your article, I think there's a 3 pronged approach to nostalgia, right?
Briefly mentioned that. Yeah, sorry.
So there's the what exactly was it? The first one is like you're gonna remember things from your past, right? Like so, it's like from when you were a kid, you're gonna remember, and then there are things that are like they're gonna be new to the new generation,
right?
That's the second.
That's like the
part.
generational crossover,
and then the third part is that you can connect with the other generation.
That's what it
and
is.
I think that's a really important thing too.
Because we're herd
because like when you become a father and you saw Star Wars when you were a kid, and you could bring your kid to go see a new Star Wars movie, and because you have such a fond remembrance of it, and you know that your kid's gonna love this new version of Star Wars, you can connect with your kid because of that, and that's such a strong thing that like exists between generations. Ways for generations to connect. Which I know this is like this article is more negative about nostalgia, but I kind of view that as like a positive part of it, and like maybe it's taken pessimistically by some people.
It's an insight to it, but there's one line. So here's what you're looking for. It's quote: "Memories acquire meaning not just in the connections in our own minds, but in the connections of the collective consciousness as a whole."
Yeah.
There's also another aspect, and thank you for that. Something sparked it in my mind. Is that we also are a ritualistic species. We have our rituals, and that is so. My dad watch every Christmas the Muppets Christmas special.
Yeah,
not the Christmas Carol, the Christmas special with Jim Henson in his amazing suit. But like we watch it every year. I've seen it. I think the copy we have came out in 1986.
Dozens of times. Yeah.
So. But like, it's become an element of tradition, and I think that is partly a tie. Not necessarily maybe the same as nostalgia, but there is
certainly
a point.
There's a crossover there
where
I would say, yeah,
something where like we have a ritual of doing the podcast now, and we're thinking fondly back, hopefully, upon these days, and that ritual aspect of it, or going with all your friends to see the new Marvel film, or watching television shows with everyone becomes part of that common collective. That
it's almost like a Jungian thing.
People. Yes, so
which they can use to exploit, but it certainly is.
But it's not necessarily exploitation because that by saying it's they
can exploit it. I'm not saying they always are, is what I mean. Yeah.
But the idea is that perhaps we're exploiting each other to make human connections, but I don't want to think of it that negatively. I think of it as just a human.
But it's fascinating seeing that, like those two things, like seeing the new version of the old thing as like a bridge between generations, where you can like say, okay, like you know, in the same way, like I mean, this isn't even a new thing, but like my parent, like as you were mentioning, like you have your thing with your dad. Me and my parents always every Christmas watch Babes in Toyland, the original Babes in Toyland, like Laurel and Hardy, and like you know every Christmas we also every Christmas Eve we watch A Christmas Story, right? So like at some point we always watch that, and like it's just a thing that's like, all right, so this is kind of like in the midpoint, right? Like A Christmas Story at least. This is like just around when I was born, I guess, that came out. So it was like something that when my parents were
it's on the cusp
my age
of
now,
that. Yeah.
Right? When my parents were around my age now, maybe a little bit younger, because I'm old as F now, but like whatever. Sorry, Chris. But like you know, it's this thing. It's like now that I'm 36, it's like, oh, I remember watching this when I was, you know, my parents were like, I remember watching this when I was 36 and you were like 3 years old or 4 years old, and like really getting it for the first, like understanding what a movie was for the first time or whatever. And like they can look back on those memories and be really nostalgic about that. And I can look back on those memories and be nostalgic about that in a very different way. And it kind of like is a bridge between generations.
Sure. It has like some Venn diagram sort of like, connection. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Speaking of Christmas, like my family's really hopped up on Christmas Story, which that's okay. I don't have a nostalgia for it, but the film that I love, which is literally one of my favorite films, was the Christmas Carol with Alistair Sim in it. And there's a bit of nostalgia. I mean, Beth and I, like, you know, before you go to bed on every Thanksgiving, put it on because it's the beginning of the Christmas season. So there's an element of nostalgia.
Sure. It's a ritual.
But you look at how many different machinations of a Christmas story or a Christmas Carol have been told. And this one's my favorite because there is a sense of nostalgia. But
Yeah, because you have a connection to
but
it.
Brian,
beyond-
but Brian Hurst made a legitimately great movie on basically a shoestring budget. I mean, he just redresses set after set after set, and the better copies we get, the more you could see the painted backgrounds, whatever. But the thing is, it's legitimately a good film, but on its own, but there is also a nostalgic quality for me in that this is the version of A Christmas Carol I grew up
Sure,
with.
of course. Like I said, it's always going to be subjective in some, like, unavoidably and to some degree, but everyone has their own personal, like, picks A, 1, 2, 3, A, B, C of whatever property it may be. And it, again, unavoidably, you can't help but experience the emotions that it creates in you.
All right. Anyone have any last things to say?
No,
Cool. I think this is a good point.
I think
too.
my final thoughts are that nostalgia can, when used well, can be okay.
Start your final thought, because I'm
Okay,
going to ask
sorry.
one question before we
Okay,
go
my
out.
bad.
Ooh.
What's your biggest nostalgia thing from your childhood?
Thing in general or like film?
And anything in general. When you think
Okay.
of your childhood, what?
Give me a second to think about.
Anyone got an answer?
X-Men is a good one. The cartoon. That's
Yeah.
big for me.
That's a very good one. I'm gonna probably say Mario Brothers 3 or
Solid.
Babes in Toyland, as I mentioned
Mhm.
earlier, because that's just been something that I've watched with my parents every Christmas for so many years now. It's like ingrained in my mind.
The two episodes that I remember is Star Trek Arena and Twilight Zone.
Twilight Zone is a good one.
Hold on a second. The two things I remember watching as a kid at age 3 was watching the Star Trek episode Arena, and then at age 4 or 5, watching before I went to my first day of kindergarten, the kindergarten orientation. We watched for some reason we watched the Twilight Zone Time Enough at Last, and I remember those because
I mean, it's the best one, obviously.
but the thing is,
Changed my mind.
There's images in it that stuck with me as a kid that resonated with me. I mean, I can go into Matchbox cars and the Miko toys and all that stuff, but yeah. I had the like city that became a briefcase, and
You've
you
opened the can of
I
worms.
remember that one.
yeah.
Tiny
That had a little
cars.
had a thing. Yeah,
What was it called? The guy that talked really fast.
Micro Machines.
Micro Machines.
giant Tinker
Micro
toys.
Machines. You remember that guy?
I did. Yeah.
The Shogun Warrior big things like with Godzilla. So there's a lot of things, but like visually, the two TV shows I remember the most were those two.
I'm gonna steal Twilight Zone for me is a big one, just in general.
I would say Courage of the Cowardly Dog really hits me because I
enough.
love cartoons back in the day. I still have nostalgic for like what I consider the original Nickelodeon lineup, which was Doug, Rugrats,
Rocco's Modern
Rocco's,
Life.
right? Yeah.
I think that was actually second generation. It was like
maybe.
like I watched them all back.
Definitely Ren and Stimpy.
Ren and Stimpy back then, but it was Courage of the Cowardly Dog for how strange it was, how matching my sense of humor and sensibilities back when I was a young man, and even to today. So that's my big nostalgia.
All right. I got one more good one. Animaniacs. Speaking of that,
I was just about to say
Cartoons.
like around that era, you have Animaniacs and Tiny Toons, which actually created really great stories from nostalgia, and then you have Courage the Cowardly Dog and Ren and Stimpy were just weirdly going into different directions.
Scott, this may be just you and me, because I think you might be like a couple years too young, and you might be a couple years too old.
A couple.
Very,
The
very good.
Goldilocks.
Listen, I wasn't going to do it again.
Go.
I've already done it once. There was like when Saturday morning cartoons happened, it was like one of the broadcast network shows.
I
Channels.
didn't have cable as a kid, so it must have been on network.
but like there were these series of like throw to commercial and come back from commercial like little things that were like, after these messages we'll be right back, and then they were all like claymation things, and it was like dogs pissing on fucking fire hydrants and shit. Do you remember those at all?
Not really.
Like I remember that so
No.
specifically.
Are you sure this existed? It wasn't like a
100%,
fever dream of you when you were a kid, but I don't remember that, Steve. Sorry. Go ahead.
So this is actually. Do any of you know what the song "Davy's on the Road Again" by Manfred Mann's Earth Band?
I don't think so.
No.
Nobody does. This was a huge problem for me when I was young
Okay.
because I had it stuck in my head for the rhythm of it stuck in my head for like a decade and a half
All right.
with no knowledge of what any of the lyrics were, and no one was familiar with the song ever.
It informed
would
your
just
shit.
pop into my head occasionally.
Nah.
You figured it out eventually?
I did.
Awesome.
And it was one of the greatest triumphs of my life because it's haunting me for years. And that is another bad aspect of nostalgia when it corrupts your mind.
Yeah.
That's the
something-
perfect one to
yeah.
go out on.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm Jonathan Emanzer, and I'm on the road again here with Scott Thurlow,
It's better the burnout than the fade away.
Steve Ramosi,
I'm going to go back and watch all my favorite cartoons.
and Christopher Morgan.
Live long and prosper. May the force be with you.
Thank you for listening to The Lost Signals discusses philosophy, narrative, and the mechanics of criticism. Editing and engineering by Jonathan E. Manzer. Music by Christopher Morgan. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.